Now, this presentation will be in two parts. Firstly, we are going to look at the writing of module learning outcomes. These are learning outcomes for modules or short courses. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to look at what's called Bloom's taxonomy to help us to write learning outcomes. Then we look at examples of if a module which has learning outcomes written for it. And thirdly then, we look at what are the common mistakes that you find when professors write learning outcomes. In any university, if you go into the website, you will see excellent examples and you will see very poor examples. And it's important that we make sure that the examples that we produce are of a good quality in terms of the quality of learning outcomes. So how do we write learning outcomes? We are very fortunate that the toolkit for writing learning outcomes was written by this man, Benjamin Bloom. Benjamin Bloom was a very interesting character. He did his degree in education in Penn State University, studied for a bachelor's and master's there, and he went off then to the University of Chicago to study for his PhD. And by all accounts, he was a very good teacher. And when he was teaching, he always had one question at the back of his mind. And that was, am I getting the students to think about what I'm teaching? So often, we go in to give a lecture, the students are there taking notes, and we wonder, am I succeeding in getting the students to really think about what I'm saying, or are they just sitting there taking notes? And in 1956, he wrote what I would say is the most important book ever written in education. It is so important that even now, when we are training our teachers, we are still using it, well over 50 years after it was written. What did he discuss in his PhD? He discussed what happens in our minds when we interact with new material, when we attempt to learn and understand new material. He proposed in his thesis that this is a process, that there are various levels of mastering a subject. Firstly, we get the knowledge. Then we try to understand what we've learned. If we understand what we've learned, we can then apply what we learned. If we can apply what we've learned, we can then move into 4, 5 and 6. Now 4, 5 and 6 are commonly referred to as the higher order thinking skills. Because if we can get our students to move into 4, 5 and 6, we are very good teachers. So here the students try to analyze what they've learned, synthesize and pull together all the various parts, and at the very top, stand back and evaluate what they have learned. So this is commonly known as the cognitive domain. Cognitive, from conocer in Spanish, you know, having to do with the mind or to think. And what Bloom said was that if we want to get our students to operate at one of these levels, we ask them to do certain things. So he said, for example, if we want to test the students' knowledge, we ask them to do something here. Define or describe or name or outline or state a fact or whatever. And he said, if we write learning outcomes in the knowledge area, examples of them would be recall or identify or describe or list or define or outline or describe again or recall. Now I want you to look at all of those learning outcomes. And I want you to notice three things about the learning outcomes. Number one, they all begin with an active verb. And that is the basic criteria for writing a learning outcomes, what the students will be able to do. The second thing about learning outcomes is they're all simple sentences. Nothing complicated. It's very obvious what they mean. And the third thing I want you to notice is they go across all subjects. We start with biology, ethics, laws, medicine, law, history, engineering, mathematics. Moving on to comprehension, Bloom in his book gave a list of active verbs. Now if you go to the original Bloom's book, you won't find the list as detailed as what I've given there. These are the ones in my own book, sorry, because I went through the literature and over the years different people gave different examples of action verbs. So these are all examples of comprehension. And if we look at examples of learning outcomes, differentiate, identify, discuss, predict, translate, convert, explain, and so on. Again, all of these are examples of learning outcomes in the area of comprehension. I'm going to move through this fairly quickly, but you will have copies of this yourselves. Moving up then to application, which Bloom defined as the ability to use learned materials. In other words, applying ideas to solve problems. And engineers are very good in this area. Again, Bloom left us with a list of action verbs. So if you have a copy, and now all of these have been translated into Spanish. So if you have the Spanish version of the book, when you are in your office and you are writing learning outcomes for modules, if you have the book open next to you, these will give you prompt words to use. And again, examples of learning outcomes: instruct, apply, select, show, relate, modify, show, and apply. Moving into the higher order thinking skills, now we are challenging the students. We're getting them to look for information into relationships between various things. Again, Bloom left a list of action or active verbs that we can use, say, when writing learning outcome, or when, for example, setting an examination question. And we have a full list of them there. And again, we have examples of learning outcomes in the area of analysis. And as you can see there, they go right across all various subjects. And we're almost at the top now of the second last one, synthesis, where we're expecting students to pull together ideas from various parts of the course. And again, Bloom left us with a list of action verbs, and you can see one there is very good. For example, summarize would be really stretching the students to summarize the key points of what they've learned. And again, examples of synthesis: recognize, propose, assemble, integrate, summarize, relate, and so on. And finally then, at the very top, we have evaluation. So they must stand back and look at everything that they've learned and make a judgment about it. And again, Bloom left us with a list of active verbs that you can use in writing the learning outcomes. And again, you have examples of learning outcomes in the area of evaluation. Words like appraise and predict and summarize again. Now, you might notice in some of the areas, the same word is in more than one. Now, that depends on the context. So, for example, supposing you were to say to the student, using the formula T equals 2 pi times square root of L over G, calculate the time for one oscillation of a pendulum. That would be an example of where you're asking the students, we just go back there to Bloom's taxonomy, this is where you're asking the students to apply a formula. Now, so the word there, calculate, would be in application. But you could also give the question and just say to the students, using the appropriate formula, calculate the periodic time of a pendulum. Then the students would have to analyse the question and find out which is the correct formula I should use. So depending on how you set the question, the word calculate could be in application or it could be in analysis. And that is why there is an overlap in some cases of words. Now, sometimes when people Google Bloom's taxonomy, they get the wrong one. So you have to be very careful. Because in 2001, Anderson and Krathwohl wrote a revision of Bloom's taxonomy. But they waited until Bloom died to do it. And I don't think Bloom would be too happy with it. Bloom's original taxonomy is the better, without a doubt. I bought this book and they spent the whole book wondering, should evaluation be here and create up there? Now, Bloom had taken create as part of synthesis. So, Bloom's taxonomy is still the one that is most often quoted. And I would strongly recommend to you, don't just Google stuff, because you'll end up probably with Anderson and Krathwohl's taxonomy. Bloom's original taxonomy makes much better sense, because the highest part would be evaluation, that you can stand back and look at everything that you've done. Whereas here, they use create. There's no point in creating something if you haven't the ability to evaluate your own creation. So this is not Bloom's taxonomy, that's Anderson and Krathwohl's taxonomy. Right. Now, other domains are in the affective, there is another affective domain. This involves attitudes. If I give you some examples, you'll know what I mean. This is where you have ethical values, judgments. So, professional standards in engineering, the need for confidentiality, the fact that engineers are interacting with the general public. They must have ethical standards, communication, ethical again, personal beliefs and ethical considerations, embracing responsibility. You can see these are particularly important in the social sciences. So for example, when we are training our teachers, we have to have high ethical standards so that our trainee teachers will treat the pupils in their classrooms correctly in a professional manner. And finally then, we have the psychomotor domain. Bloom never did any work on the psychomotor domain. The psychomotor, the mind and hand and eye movement. It's all about making stuff. And Bloom didn't write a book on that. But we look at it in the area of laboratory skills, for example, or instrumentation, like in mechanical engineering, using a lathe and so on, designing parts of an aircraft. And also, of course, you could bring in presentation skills as well. What does a module look like? This is an example of a module, and I picked it because I think it's a good example. These are final year dental students. In this university, every module is introduced by the same sentence. And the sentence is, on successful completion of this module, students should be able to. Now we put that in way back in 2006 as a prompt to our professors that they must use active verbs there at the beginning. And this was written by Eleanor O'Sullivan. She was doing our course, our Masters in Teaching and Learning. And if you look at them, summarize, formulate, arrange tests, administer. There's a psychomotor, one there. Recognize, differentiate, manage demands of times, and manage patients. So you can see there, every one begins with an active verb. We recommend use of bullet points rather than 1, 2, 3. Because if you put 1, 2, 3, it's as if you are putting the most important ones first. And of course, they may all be of equal importance. Some may be more important than others at different parts of the course. So better to use bullet points. Now, in Bloom's taxonomy, therefore, what has he done? He's looked at the cognitive domain. He's looked at the psychomotor domain, skills, and he's looked then at the attitudinal domain. And these three overlap to give a person who can do the job. Now, in the English language, the word competent simply means that you can do your job properly. There is no point in having all the knowledge and the skills to be, say, a good doctor if you cannot deal properly with your patients. So Bloom's taxonomy summarizes very nicely the three important skills that every degree should have: knowledge, attitudes, and skills. So, whereas the ECTS credit system is the common currency for education, as we said this morning, learning outcomes are the common language. When the students achieve the learning outcomes, they are rewarded by getting so many credits. The great advantage of learning outcomes, as we said this morning, is you can compare one country with another. So for international recognition or for professional recognition. Last summer I was out in Genoa in Italy, where there was a group of engineers, again working on a master's programme, something similar to the project that ye are doing. And so they were very interested in making sure that their master's programme had international recognition. Now, what about this term competency? Where does it come from and why is it so problematic? I remember a number of years ago, I was out in Porto and there was a conference there organised in the Department of Engineering in the University of Porto. It was a huge EU conference, hundreds of people. And I was sitting up on the front row as one of the lecturers at the conference. And the man sitting next to me was a very famous professor, Lucien Bollaert. He is an engineer. And I said, Lucien, what are you speaking on? And he said, I'm speaking on competences. I said, that's very interesting, Lucien. I'm just after finishing writing a paper on the relationship between competences and learning outcomes. And I said, there must be 100 different definitions of the word competence. There are 224, he told me. So the term competence is an extremely vague term which different people in different countries interpret in different ways. I will explain in the second half of this what exactly this word competence is interpreted in Europe. So what is the challenge that we have of writing learning outcomes? It's very important that we write them clearly so that everybody understands. It's good in your university if you have a leader in type of statement. It's important you keep the sentences short and clear. Generally, for every module, the recommendation in the literature is that you write a maximum of 8 learning outcomes. So 8 learning outcomes maximum. In this university, we allow people to write up to 9 they write more than 9, we get back to them and say, you are being too specific. Leave it at 8 to give yourself a bit of leeway when setting examination papers. It is very important when writing learning outcomes that you do not mix up the language of aims and objectives with the language of learning outcomes. That is the most common mistake. The mistake is well documented in the literature, where professors forget that they must use active verbs. Now, there's an example of some of the literature. If I had to summarize it in one sentence, it would be the following. When writing learning outcomes, do not use words like know, understand, or be familiar with. Those words are the language of aims and objectives. When writing learning outcomes, you must write active verbs, what the students can do, because learning outcomes are part of the student-centered approach to teaching and learning. So in the book, there is like a checklist. When you have finished your paperwork on writing the learning outcomes, these are some of the questions that you must ask yourselves. And we try to get the full range. Maybe in first year engineering at undergraduate level, you are building up their knowledge. So a lot of the learning outcomes may come from the bottom half of Bloom's taxonomy. But as the students go up towards second, third, fourth year and into masters, a lot of the learning outcomes should come from the higher order thinking skills. Just like the example I showed you, they were final year dental students, and a lot of the learning outcomes were coming from the top half of Bloom's taxonomy. So in the first half of this presentation, my learning outcomes were, hopefully you can now describe what the term learning outcome means. A statement of what a student should know, understand, and be able to do at the end of a learning process. Hopefully you can see we can use Bloom's taxonomy to write learning outcomes, that we can apply Bloom's taxonomy to help us to write learning outcomes, and we'll be able to summarize the advantages of learning outcomes in terms of learning outcomes being the international language. The next thing I want to do now, if my colleague could help me to stop this one, and then we put on another one. Now, do I have to go on to a Panopto, or can I just keep on with this? Is that still okay? Yeah, you might just check that this is on Panopto. So the first half of this presentation was on module learning outcomes. So you have the basic rules for writing learning outcomes, and if you have a copy of the Spanish translation or the English version of the learning outcomes book, what many professors told me is that they had the book next to them as they were filling in the learning outcomes on the computer. Every professor in this university was sent a copy of the book by the president of the university.
That's the one.
Okay. Are we in business? Perfect.
That's the one.
This is excellent. Okay. So, in the first half of the presentation, we looked at module learning outcomes. Now we want to look at program learning outcomes. So, if you are starting a new master's program, the first thing you must do, number one, numero uno, is to write the program learning outcomes. Because once you have the program learning outcomes written, you can then design the modules to make sure that you achieve those program learning outcomes. And I will now show you how to do that. We'll first look at what are program learning outcomes and how do they differ from module learning outcomes. What are the rules for writing program learning outcomes? What type of program learning outcomes should be included in our master's program? and what are the benefits, and also what are some of the problems that learning outcomes can cause us. Now, what are program learning outcomes? That is the definition. You need to summarize in program learning outcomes the knowledge, skills, and attitudes. Remember those three overlapping circles. Everything comes back to Bloom's taxonomy. Because Bloom's taxonomy is the foundation for writing learning outcomes. The rules for writing program learning outcomes and module learning outcomes are exactly the same. Always begin with an active verb, keep the sentences simple and easily understood. When you are writing program learning outcomes, you should write somewhere between 5 and 10 maximum. Now, if a student is thinking of coming to your university to study this master's program, the first thing they should see, are program learning outcomes. Now, this university does it badly because the program learning outcomes on our website, they're pushed at the bottom. The program learning outcomes should give a prospective student an idea, an instant idea of what they'll be able to do when they graduate from this program. Now, when you're writing program learning outcomes, there are two types of program learning outcomes that you should consider. The first type is the ones that summarize and synthesize the learning outcomes that have already been assessed within the various modules. So you might have maybe 10 learning outcomes written, and those 10 learning outcomes will summarize what the students have learned in all the various modules in the program, in year 1, 2, 3, or whatever. The second type of learning outcome is called an aspirational learning outcome. Aspirational or desirable. Something you will hope that the students will achieve after they have left the program, or something that you cannot assess while they are on the program. I'll give you some examples of this in a moment. This is an undergraduate degree. Okay, now look at the program learning outcomes. Recognize and apply, identify, develop portfolios, evaluate theories, critically evaluate. Now, here's display willingness. Okay, so this is the affective domain now of Bloom. Okay, foster an interest, enthusiasm, synthesize the key components, and this is communicate. Now that last one is an aspirational learning outcome. Why do I say that's an aspirational learning outcome? This is a program that I coordinate, and the students come for 4 years to train to become teachers of physics or chemistry or biology. I would hope that if I was to visit those students in their schools in 5 years' time, that these students would show great communication with the school community, that they could bring their own pupils away to science fairs, that they would set up exhibitions at open days, and that these communication skills would be very obvious. But I cannot assess this learning outcome while they are still students. It's only when they go out as full-time teachers that I could assess it. And that's why it's called aspiration. I would hope that all the various parts of what they learned in 4 years' time would be synthesized by them when they go out as full-time teachers. So that's an example of an aspirational. This is an undergraduate degree in engineering. What are engineers good at? They're good at solving problems. Okay? And you recognize many of those, derive, apply solutions, identify, analyze. Notice you can have more than one active verb in a learning outcome. Nothing at all wrong with that. Engineers are good at designing. Now, here's an important one. Here's the affective domain. Work effectively as an individual. That's very important, that they have teamwork. I remember a few years ago, I was asked by the government of Lithuania to look at master's programs in a number of universities in Lithuania. And I was one of about 6 people. And we spent a week in Lithuania going around various universities, and we got presentations from various professors. And one of the things I was very impressed with in Lithuania is that the people who were involved in designing the master's courses were local employers as well as the academics. Usually it's just the academics who design the course, but these universities were very clever. They said, if we are turning out engineering graduates, the people who are employing our engineers should be involved in writing the learning outcomes and in designing the course. So that's something that you might consider. Don't just keep your design team within the university. Bring in people from the outside. And this was one of the things that the employers emphasized. There is no point in us having geniuses of engineers if they cannot work well with their colleagues. So that's an important program learning outcome, and again, the communication skills also. And this is a master's in computer science degree. And again, as you can see, the program learning outcomes, problem solving, organizing and manipulating data, and so on. Okay, and there's other examples. I just leave those there, and you can study them in your own case. So again, I'm saying to you, everything comes back to Bloom's taxonomy. The knowledge, the skills, and the attitude, all overlapping to give us somebody who can do a job well. Now, I mentioned earlier that this word competence causes a problem. One definition of competence is this one on the board, which is the European definition of the term competence. Now, notice this is the European qualifications framework for lifelong learning. And these are what are called generic descriptors on which the learning outcomes at each level can be based. So this would be bachelor, master's, PhD. How do they mention, or how do they divide up the various generic skills? They divide up into knowledge, skills, and competence. Notice that in this definition, in the European qualifications framework, which in my opinion is the best definition, because at least they brought clarity to their definition, competence is completely separate from knowledge and skills. Completely separate. Competence is defined as responsibility and autonomy, the ability to do the job well. If instead of using the word competence, they had gone back to Bloom's taxonomy and talked about knowledge, skills, and attitude, it would have made it so much easier and leave out this word competence altogether. But in the European qualifications framework, so competence is completely separate from knowledge and skills. It is all about performing in the workplace. And they say at master's level, it says, take responsibility for contributing to professional knowledge and practice and for reviewing the strategic performance of teams. So at master's level, somebody should have the ability to manage a team. In other words, they should show leadership quality. So in the European context, competence is performance in the workplace. Leadership qualities like ethical values and values in general are all used. Now, when you're writing program learning outcomes, what I have done here is give you some prompt words from various workshops that I've given around the world. the professors often ask me, if we want to write a program learning outcome in the area of knowledge, where do we start? This is where you start. So you look at your master's program and you look at these prompt words here and you say, are any of them relevant to what my master's program is all about? What about skills? Now the word skills is a very broad term. Skills in the European qualification framework. If we just go back to this diagram, this is on the web and it's a very important. This is like our Bible for drawing up new programs in Europe to be compliant with Bologna. Now skills are described as cognitive, in other words, thinking skills, logical, intuitive and creative thinking, and practical, involving manual dexterity. So in Europe, the word skills involves both skills of the mind and manual dexterity skills, very broad. And knowledge is described as theoretical or factual, as you'd expect anyway. So knowledge, skills and competence are in the European qualifications framework. In fact, going back to Lucien Bollaert, the engineer who was speaking at Porto, and we've worked together on many training courses, he was saying that if they knew then what they know now, they would in fact have put in values there. It would have caused a lot less problems with this word competence. So we have knowledge, then we have skills, and there's lots of things in skills. So these are all examples of sentences which start examining skills of the students. There's lots of them: formulate options, diagnose problems, integrate a range of transferable skills are something that turn up in a lot of program learning outcomes now. So there's lots of other skills, for example, and then the attitudes, displaying ethical practice, defending the need for personal responsibility, work professionally as part of a team, accept accountability, and so on, work autonomously or as a member of a team. So they'll be a great help to you. And so we come to the final part, mapping the program learning outcomes onto the module learning outcomes. Now this is key to getting your masters constructed properly. So where are we starting? We're starting with a blank page and we're asking ourselves, what do we want our students to be able to do when they complete this master's program? So we write our program learning outcomes, maximum of 10. And so here are our program learning outcomes across the top of the grid. And then we must decide what modules are we going to put in order to achieve those program learning outcomes. So we might have maybe 12 or more different modules in our master's program. Now, what we have to show for accreditation by the Institute of Engineers or whoever is accrediting the program, we have to show in this grid where each program is covered in the particular modules. Now, I'll give you some examples of this. This was a course sent to me a number of years ago in which I was asked to be the external examiner. It was written, very well written, by an Institute of Technology. It's like a technological university here in Ireland. And the first thing I looked at were the program learning outcomes. So this is an MSc. Okay, program learning outcome 1, discuss. Learning outcome 2, evaluate. Program number 2, proficiency. Program number 4, apply, select and apply. Program learning outcome 5, integrate, initiate research. That would be important. Okay. Contribute professionally, critically appraise. Okay, so the masters had 8 program learning outcomes. Now, So this is what the team designed. They said every student from this master's program should be able to do all of those. Now, what did they do? This is the list of the 8 program learning outcomes along here. These are the names of all of the modules. So program learning outcome 2 was covered in the toxicology testing. It was also covered in analytical. It was also covered in biochemical. It was also covered in that one. Now, that grid is vitally important for any master's program that you design. Because what it is showing is, it is showing the accreditation organization that you have done your groundwork. The program learning outcomes are mapped onto the module learning outcomes. And you're showing that you have made a distinct effort to build one or more modules in which these program learning outcomes are achieved. Now, without that map, you cannot get accreditation, because without the map, it means you haven't made up the roadmap for yourself. By producing this grid, and it's very simple, and to engineers in the English language we say it is a piece of cake. Do you understand what I mean?
Yes.
So for engineers, this work is absolute cake. For the arts people, they're all over the place. They'll never make sense of it. But for engineers, who've ever done, no problem at all. So that grid, I cannot emphasize the importance of that grid. Now, one of the best master's degrees in education that I ever supervised was a master's degree done by one of our professors in chemical engineering here in this university, John Fitzpatrick. And he did his master's degree on the importance of program learning outcomes. And he looked at the effect of introducing learning outcomes into the Faculty of Engineering. And he said the one thing that the students liked was when he got all the first year students in the first day, and he showed them the program learning outcomes. When you graduate from this university in 4 years' time, this is what you will be able to do. And it brought clarity to their minds. And he wrote a very good paper in this area that was published there in Education for Chemical Engineers. So what are the benefits and what are some of the problems that learning outcomes can cause? Stephen Adams, who was one of the great architects of the Bologna process, described learning outcomes as the building blocks. Without learning outcomes, you don't have transparency. Because before learning outcomes, we had these fuzzy things called competences. And everybody had a different idea of what competences were about. And there were no rules for writing competences. So it didn't make sense. But the movement from competences to learning outcomes was like looking through the microscope, as I explained earlier on. There was a very good paper written by 2 people from Holland, the Netherlands, and they described competences as a fuzzy concept that nobody really understands what competences are all about. But learning outcomes get rid of that fuzziness and bring clarity. And that is what Stephen Adams said. There was another lady who wrote a marvellous book, article, a paper in a journal, Judith Allen. And she said, learning outcomes are a celebration of students' learning. She said, by writing down the learning outcomes, we are advertising our program. That a student who graduates with a master's in engineering from our university, this is what they will be able to do. and we're putting it up on the web and we're telling the world about it. So sometimes we don't tend to be too good at marketing our programs, but of course learning outcomes is the ideal marketing tool. So what are the benefits of learning outcomes? If you look at the literature, they're well documented. Firstly, we are making it clear to students what they must achieve. We are setting it out from day one, what we expect of them. And that helps to motivate them and give them a sense of purpose so that they will achieve the learning outcomes. The second thing is that it helps us to be better teachers, because we focus on achieving the learning outcomes. When I come out and I visit my student teachers, after the lesson we go off to a quiet corner for a chat. And one of the first questions I asked them was, what were the learning outcomes of your lesson? And do you think you achieved them? So all of our student teachers have to write learning outcomes. And the very last slide that they show their own pupils must be the learning outcomes. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to. And that initiates great discussions between our student teachers and between their own pupils. So this is very important for us as professors at university level. The third thing is that we are using the same language with our colleagues, with our external examiners. Everybody understands the concept of a learning outcome because it has international recognition. It has a simple definition with simple rules for writing. Fourthly, it helps us to think about assessment. So if you have a learning outcome, you have to think about, will I assess it by a written paper? Is it a practical? Psychomotor skills, for example? Is it best assessed by means of a project? How am I going to assess teamwork, for example? So this whole area of assessment is very important. And lastly, of course, because learning outcomes are so simply written, employers like them because they get away from this jargon and this fuzziness of competences, and they're written so clearly. And in this university, learning outcomes were the catalyst. I remember after the first training session, a professor came up to me and he said, I was appointed here as a professor because of my research. And I came here 10 years ago and they told me, and these are the classes you will be teaching. But nobody ever gave me any help to become a better teacher. He said, I was just thrown into the water and I had to learn how to swim for myself. So the introduction of learning outcomes at this university has served as a catalyst. And Marion this afternoon will be telling you about all the wonderful courses that she runs here for our professors. And it all started with